So, in 1921, a literary magazine operating out of New York City was actually taken to court and successfully prosecuted.
Right, which is wild to think about today.
It really is. The editors were fingerprinted, they were fined, and get this, the United States Post Office confiscated and burned entire print runs of their magazine.
Just literally throwing literature into a fire.
Exactly. And their crime. They published a story that dared to describe, in microscopic, unfiltered detail, a completely ordinary man walking through a city, eating his breakfast, going to a funeral, and, well, going to the bathroom.
And for that, they were convicted of obscenity.
Yeah. Welcome to this deep dive. Today we have a mission, and it's an absolute mammoth of an undertaking. We are going to embark on this epic, mythic journey without ever leaving the confines of a single city on a single day.
It is an incredible piece of literary history. That magazine was the Little Review, by the way.
Right.
And the text the courts found so dangerous, so deeply offensive to public morals, was actually the serialization of a novel that would permanently break the boundaries of human literature.
For you, the listener, we are unpacking an incredibly dense, genuinely fascinating stack of source material surrounding James Joyce's monumental works. We're primarily looking at his 1922 classic, the novel Ulysses, along with its crucial precursor, the 1914 short story collection Dubliners.
And the sources we have in front of us today are just incredibly rich. They give us this multi-dimensional view of Joyce's project.
Yeah, because we aren't just looking at textual excerpts from a classic books edition.
No, not at all. We actually have period photographs to help ground us in the physical reality of what we're reading.
Which I love.
It helps so much. We have a striking image of Sackville Street and O'Connell Bridge circa 1900. You can see the horse-drawn trams, the cobblestones, the dense crowds.
Let's go busy.
It does. We also have a photograph of 86 St. Stephen's Green, which is the very building where Joyce studied modern languages from 1898 to 1902.
And beyond the photos, we have some phenomenal publication artifacts. We're looking at the original title pages from the Shakespeare & Company first edition.
The famous bookstore in Paris.
Yeah, the one that finally took the risk to publish the book in its entirety. Plus, we have a cover of that scandalous magazine we mentioned, The Little Review, which serialized the book from 1918 to 1920 before the obscenity ruling shut them down.
And my personal favorite, we even have a glimpse into Joyce's own handwritten notebook, simply titled Words.
Oh man, that notebook.
It is a chaotic, beautiful glimpse into a genius's laboratory, really. Having those physical artifacts, the photographs of the streets, the notebook pages, it really grounds the text.
It totally does.
It reminds us that while this book is considered high art, it was built out of the dirt, the brick, and the daily grind of an actual functioning city.
And here is why this matters to you, listening right now. If you're the kind of person who loves to learn, who wants to understand the cultural touchstones of our world, but who absolutely hates feeling overwhelmed by massive, impenetrable texts.
Which is very understandable with Ulysses.
Oh, completely. But this deep dive is the ultimate shortcut. We're taking one of the most infamously complex novels in human history, a book that people spend their entire academic careers trying to decode, and we're distilling it down.
We're finding those most brilliant, emotional, and surprising nuggets of insight. We're going to bypass the intimidation factor.
Exactly. The goal is to look at the mechanics of the text, to understand not just what Joyce wrote, but how he wrote it, and why it revolutionized the way we think about the human mind.
But before we jump into the streets of Dublin, there's a very important disclaimer we need to make about the source material.
Yes, definitely. Good point.
The texts we are examining today are historical documents of a very specific time and place. They contain characters who express intense, historically specific political and religious viewpoints.
Because the Dublin of 1904 was essentially a powder keg, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was a politically charged environment dominated by questions of empire, religion, and national identity. So in these excerpts, we will encounter fervent Irish nationalism, staunch defenses of British imperialism, and blatant, virulent anti-Semitism expressed by the characters.
Right. And we want to make it explicitly clear to you, the listener, that we are not taking sides here.
Not at all.
Nor are we endorsing any of these viewpoints. Our role today is strictly to analyze these elements impartially. We're treating them as factual components of the character psychologies and the historical reality that Joyce was meticulously documenting.
We're looking at the canvas of the text, examining the paint he used, without making political statements of our own. To understand the psychological depth of these characters, we really have to look honestly at the prejudices, the anger, and the tribalism that shaped their environment.
Because Joyce didn't sanitize his city.
No, he presented it in all its ugly, glorious complexity.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We are starting our journey not with the epic wandering of Ulysses, but with the foundation that made it possible. We are starting with the source excerpts from Dubliners.
Right, his short story collection.
Yeah, and right out of the gate, we run into this incredibly heavy, oppressive concept that seems to dictate everything.
To understand the world James Joyce built, you really first have to understand the concept of paralysis. It is the invisible governing force of these early stories.
Paralysis.
Yeah. In the very first excerpt from Dubliners, a story called The Sisters, we are introduced to a young boy who is looking up at the window of a house where a priest is dying.
The boy reflects on the word paralysis, right?
It does. He says it had always sounded strange to him, like a term from geometry or some bizarre religious concept. But now, staring at that window, it sounds to him like, quote, some maleficent and sinful being.
A maleficent and sinful being. That is such a terrifying, vivid way for a child to personify a medical condition.
It really is.
But looking at the rest of these stories, it's not just a medical condition, is it? It's something much more insidious spreading through the whole city.
Exactly. Joyce uses physical paralysis as the central metaphor for the spiritual, emotional, and cultural state of the entire population. He saw Dublin as a city that was stuck.
Unable to move forward.
Right, paralyzed by the competing weights of the Catholic Church, the British Empire, and its own mythologized history. We see this exact same maleficent force freezing characters in place throughout all the Dubliners' excerpts.
Let's look at the story, Eveline, because this one is just devastating. We have a young woman who finally has a tangible chance to escape a miserable, abusive life at home.
She's literally standing at the ferry barrier.
Yes, her lover is on a Norwegian vessel, calling out to her to board the ship, to cross the sea, and to start a brand new life in Buenos Aires. The door to freedom is wide open. And what happens?
The text describes her at the barrier, and she is suddenly gripped by this absolute inability to act. The prose says she is frozen like a helpless animal.
Wow. A helpless animal.
Yeah, she sets her white face to him, completely passive. She literally cannot physically move her body to get on the boat.
It's agonizing to read. She clutches the iron railing. She isn't held back by guards or a lack of money.
No, it's entirely internal.
She is psychologically paralyzed by duty, by the familiar terror of her environment, and by the sheer weight of her past. She chooses the misery she knows over the freedom she doesn't.
That is the absolute essence of Joyce's paralysis. It is an internal trap. And we see a different, maybe more intellectual kind of paralysis in the excerpt from A Painful Case.
Oh, Mr. James Duffy.
Yes, Mr. Duffy. Here, we are introduced to a man who lives in a suburb called Chapelizod, and the text notes he lives there specifically because he wishes to live as far as possible from the city of which he is a citizen.
Right away, you get the sense of a guy who is actively rejecting life. Like he is withdrawing from society.
Oh, completely. And the text gives us these agonizingly precise details about his room. It's uncarpeted and somber. But the detail that really sticks out is his bookshelf.
I remember this.
He arranges his books strictly by bulk, from the largest books at the bottom to the smallest at the top.
Just think about what that reveals about a person's mind. Organizing knowledge, not by subject, not by author, not by meaning, but by the sheer physical dimensions of the object.
It's bizarre.
It is a desperate, superficial attempt to assert control over his environment. It's the architecture of a completely rigid mind.
And the sources mention he is translating a heavy piece of literature, a play called Michael Kramer by the German dramatist Gerhard Hauptmann. But inside his desk, right alongside his translation materials, he has pasted an ironical advertisement for bile beans.
Bile beans.
Yeah, they were a real-world, incredibly common patent medicine at the time. A cheap digestive pill marketed to cure biliousness and stomach aches.
So here's Mr. Duffy trying to elevate himself, right? Trying to engage with high European literature, but his immediate physical reality is literally dictated by a cheap, mass-produced ad for a stomach remedy.
It's a great contrast.
It's like his intellectual aspirations are constantly being dragged down by the mundane, inescapable reality of his environment.
He is paralyzed by his own need for control, his cynicism, and his total inability to connect with other human beings. The tragedy of Dubliners is that the characters occasionally dream of escape, they look toward the horizon, but they never quite make it out.
Yeah, like in the story A Little Cloud.
Exactly. We see a character named Little Chandler meeting up with an old friend, Ignatius Gallagher, and Gallagher's the one who got away. He found success in the London press.
So he comes back and just rubs it in.
Basically, yeah. Gallagher sits in the pub lecturing Little Chandler about the wild cocottes, the women of Paris, and condescendingly refers to their hometown as dear, dirty Dublin.
And little Chandler just absorbs it. He listens to these tales of cosmopolitan freedom, and he goes home feeling completely suffocatingly trapped in his domestic life.
Listening to his own child cry.
Right, realizing he will never be a poet, he will never see Paris, he is just stuck in dear, dirty Dublin.
Even when flashes of modernity and excitement do arrive in the city, it doesn't belong to the citizens. In the excerpt from After the Race, we see wealth and industry speeding through the streets of Dublin in the form of French and German race cars participating in a motor derby.
The continent has come to Ireland.
But how does Joyce describe the local Dubliners watching the cars?
He calls them the gratefully oppressed,
Mm.
which is just a brutal summary of colonial subjugation. They are standing on the sidewalks, cheering for a wealth, a speed, and a mobility that they themselves are entirely locked out of.
They are spectators to their own exclusion.
Wait, I'm stuck on something here. Looking at all this, Mr. Duffy's depressing room, Eveline freezing at the docks, little Chandler's despair. If Dublin is truly this paralyzed, this dull, this oppressive, well, why did Joyce dedicate his entire life, his absolute genius, to writing about it?
That's a fair question.
If you think a place is a cultural graveyard, why spend decades meticulously documenting every cobblestone?
That is the central animating paradox of James Joyce's life and art. He believed that the only way to conquer the paralysis was to expose it with absolute, unflinching honesty.
So he had to study the disease to cure it.
He couldn't cure it without first mapping every single symptom.
It makes me think of a snow globe. When you were standing inside the snow globe, you're just getting buried in the cold. You are part of the storm. You can't see the shape of the thing that's trapping you.
Yes, exactly. You lack the perspective to understand the boundaries of your own environment.
But if you step outside of it, and the sources include that 1919 photo of Joyce sitting in Zurich, showing he did physically leave Ireland for mainland Europe, once you are outside, you can hold that snow globe in your hand.
You can see the whole picture.
You can shake it up from afar, over and over, and obsessively watch exactly how and where every single flake settles. He had to physically exile himself from the snow globe to clearly see the glass.
The physical distance was the prerequisite for his creative intimacy. From cities like Trieste, Zurich, and Paris, he carried Dublin in his memory with a cartographic, almost obsessive precision.
He practically memorized the city directory.
He really did. But you're right, this deep obsession with documenting a paralyzed city presented a massive artistic problem. Think about the mechanics of storytelling. How do you write a dynamic, engaging, epic story about people whose defining characteristic is that they are inherently stuck?
You can't use the traditional rules of the novel. If the characters can't go on a grand external adventure, the adventure has to move inward.
That is the leap. To break out of the stylistic paralysis of Dubliners, he needed to invent an entirely new form of literature, a form capable of capturing the speed of human thought.
And that necessity leads us directly to the morning of June 16th, 1904. It leads us to the opening scene of Ulysses.
We are shifting gears from the short stories to the epic.
We dive right into the opening of Ulysses, set at the Martello Tower at Sandy Cove. And the sources note that this tower overlooking the sea is actually a James Joyce museum today.
Which just shows how heavily this specific location looms in literary history. It is arguably the most famous opening scene in modern literature, and it establishes the central psychological conflicts immediately.
We are introduced to two characters right away.
Oh,
The first is described as stately, plump Buck Mulligan.
quite an intro.
He comes from the stairhead, carrying a bowl of shading ladder, a mirror, and a razor crossed over it. He's wearing an ungirdled yellow dressing gown, catching the morning air, and he holds the bowl aloft and intones a Latin phrase, in troibo ad altar Dei.
Meaning, I will go into the altar of God. It is the opening line of the traditional Catholic Latin Mass. Mulligan is performing a theatrical mock mass, using his shaving bowl as the sacred chalice.
Just completely irreverent.
Highly irreverent, loud, and completely at ease in his environment.
And watching him perform this mockery is our second character, Stephen Dedalus. If you've read Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, you know Stephen. He is the brooding, intellectual, hypersensitive artist.
And the psychological tension between Mulligan's loud joviality and Stephen's dark silence is palpable from the very first paragraph.
Mulligan is relentless. He looks out at Dublin Bay and playfully calls it the snot green sea.
Such a gross description.
Right. He also calls it the scrotum tightening sea. He even flexes his classical education, quoting the ancient Greeks, shouting, "Thalata, Thalata,
Yeah.
the sea, the sea." He expansively calls the ocean our great sweet mother.
But Stephen is not having fun. The text paints a devastating picture of his internal state. He's wearing secondhand clothes. He's currently in mourning for his recently deceased mother.
Oh, right.
And when Mulligan casually, playfully calls the sea a great sweet mother, it acts as a massive psychological trigger for Stephen. It unleashes this horrific, traumatic imagery in his mind.
This is where Joyce's mastery of sensory detail comes in. Stephen doesn't remember a peaceful, romanticized deathbed. His memory is violently visceral.
It's hard to read.
He remembers his dying mother's breath smelling of wetted ashes. He remembers a bowl of white china beside her bed, holding the green, sluggish bile she had vomited up from her rotting liver.
So when Mulligan shoves a bowl of green shaving lather in his face and talks about the snot green sea as a mother, Stephen is internally collapsing under the weight of this trauma.
The outside world is constantly assaulting his internal grief.
And Mulligan, whether intentionally or not, makes it so much worse. We find out through their tense dialogue that shortly after Stephen's mother died, Stephen overheard Mulligan talking to his aunt.
I remember this part.
And Mulligan casually referred to her death by saying, "Oh, it's only Dedalus whose mother is beastly dead."
Beastly dead. That is a shockingly callous, reductive phrase to use about your friend's mother.
It really is.
But let me ask you about this, because I'm looking at Mulligan's defense in the text, and I want to make sure I'm reading the dynamic right. When Stephen confronts him about that phrase, Mulligan doesn't back down.
He doesn't apologize.
He basically says, look, I'm a medical student. I see death every day in the Mater Hospital. It's a biological fact. It's a beastly thing and nothing else. He tells Stephen to stop the moody brooding.
And points out that Stephen himself refused to kneel down and pray for his mother when she asked him to on her deathbed.
Right. So isn't Mulligan just being a harsh pragmatist?
Yeah.
Why does this one medical comment break Stephen so thoroughly?
It's a great question. Because on a surface level, Mulligan's defense is entirely logical. He is defending himself with the cold pragmatism of science. But if we look at the mechanics of Stephen's mind, we realize this isn't just about biological death.
What is it about then?
It is about spiritual exile. Stephen is a character who defines his entire existence, his entire identity, by what he refuses to submit to. He refused to pray at his mother's deathbed because he absolutely rejects the authority of the Catholic Church.
He rejects the British Empire, too.
Yes, and he rejects romanticized Irish nationalism.
He's stripped away all his allegiances. He's a man without a country, a man without a religion, standing on his own native soil.
Precisely. And that extreme isolation leaves him incredibly vulnerable. When Mulligan casually says she is beastly dead, he is reducing Stephen's massive, soul-crushing spiritual rebellion, the guilt of denying a dying mother's wish, into a meaningless biological footnote.
It invalidates his entire philosophical struggle.
That is what Stephen can't forgive.
There is this incredible moment that captures this perfectly. Mulligan thrusts a cracked mirror in front of Stephen's face so he can see his own brooding expression. And Stephen looks at his reflection in the broken glass and says, "It is a symbol of Irish art, the cracked-looking glass of a servant."
That phrase, the cracked-looking glass of a servant, is a profound diagnosis of his culture. He is saying that Ireland cannot produce true original art because it is entirely subservient.
Subservient politically to the British and spiritually to the Church of Rome.
Exactly. An artist in Ireland can only hold up a broken mirror to a colonized world.
He feels utterly surrounded by usurpers. He's living in this Martello Tower, which, by the way, was originally built by the British to defend against Napoleon. He's paying the rent, but he feels pushed out by Mulligan's boisterous mockery.
And to make matters worse, there is a third roommate.
Right, an Oxford-educated English student named Haynes, whom Stephen resentfully describes as ponderous Saxon. Stephen feels intellectually and spiritually homeless in his own home. He has no place to rest.
And what is truly brilliant about the architecture of Ulysses is how Joyce utilizes that specific feeling of isolation. Stephen's feeling of high-minded intellectual and spiritual homelessness perfectly mirrors the physical and social homelessness of our next major character.
A character who enters the story as a completely different kind of outcast, functioning on a completely different frequency.
Which means it is time to meet the man of the hour. We are entering Section 3 and the introduction of Leopold Bloom.
If Stephen Dedalus is all abstract theology, linguistic theory, and tortured high art, Leopold Bloom is the ultimate grounded, physical, practical man.
The contrast is jarring in the best way possible. When we switch to Bloom's perspective, the text gives us this incredible window into his mind. It is a constant, flowing stream of highly practical, deeply empathetic, and sometimes surprisingly morbid observations.
We catch up with Bloom as he is riding in a carriage to a funeral for a man named Paddy Dignam. He's in this cramped carriage with Martin Cunningham and Simon Dedalus, who, interestingly, is Stephen's estranged alcoholic father.
The carriage ride is a masterclass in internal monologue. As they ride toward the cemetery, we get to experience the raw data feed of Bloom's brain. It is deeply sensory and highly associative.
While the other men in the carriage are making grand, pompous, performative statements about life, death, and tragedy, Bloom's mind is working on the actual logistics of reality.
He's watching the city roll by through the carriage window. He thinks about the tramways and how the tracks are laid.
They pass the O'Connell Circle at the cemetery, the monument to the great Irish political leader Daniel O'Connell. And Simon Dedalus, playing the part of the tragic Irishman, makes this grand, weeping speech about how O'Connell's heart is buried in Rome. But how many broken hearts are buried here?
It is very theatrical.
So theatrical. And how does Bloom react to that?
Bloom entirely bypasses the melodrama. He looks out the window at the cemetery caretaker, a man named John O'Connell, and Bloom starts thinking about what a remarkably stable job the caretaker has.
He internally jokes to himself that the caretaker has a great gig because of habeas corpus.
Meaning, you have the body.
Right. The dead bodies are legally bound there. In his mind, he thinks, no pass-out checks. Once you're in the cemetery, you're a permanent customer.
It is a brilliant, quiet juxtaposition. He completely demystifies death. He refuses to engage in the romanticization of grief.
Later, when they are walking through the graveyard, he doesn't think of angels or clouds or heavenly rest. He notices the grim physical reality. He thinks about a bag of corpse gas sopping in foul brine.
He notices a rat weaving through the crypts.
His mind even goes on this wild, futuristic tangent where he envisions a communal kitchen in the future where people eat tabloids like nutritional pills because human teeth are getting worse from cheap food.
It's so scattershot.
I was reading these excerpts and I kept thinking of a very modern analogy. Bloom feels like the 1904 equivalent of a guy doom scrolling on social media.
Oh, that's a really interesting way to put it.
You know when you're swiping and you see a tragic news story followed by an ad for shoes, followed by a funny dog video, and your brain just processes it all simultaneously. That is Bloom's walk through Dublin.
He's absorbing all this random data.
Right. Ads for plum trees, potted meat plastered on the side of a tram, the squeak of a door, the rats in the graveyard, the sad old men on the street.
The doom-scrolling analogy actually holds up because it captures the sheer volume of unfiltered information hitting his consciousness. But unlike a passive scroller, Bloom is actively trying to synthesize the information.
But that raises a question for the reader. If you are just trying to follow a plot, what is the point of knowing Bloom's passing thoughts on tramway logistics or the decuts of human teeth? What does all this noise add up to?
Well, the noise is the architecture of his empathy. Bloom takes in everything, he observes everything because he is fundamentally an outsider trying to read a room that he doesn't quite belong in.
He has to be hyper-aware of his surroundings to survive them.
Right. The sources make it clear that Bloom is of Jewish descent, living in a fiercely Catholic and culturally nationalist Ireland at the turn of the century. He is an anomaly in this very insular city.
Think about the psychological reality of being the only outsider in a tightly knit community. When you walk into a room where you know you aren't fully welcome, what happens?
You become hyper-observant.
Exactly. You notice every squeak of a chair, every sideways glance, the tone of every voice. That hyper-awareness is exactly what Bloom is weaponizing to survive his day.
He is constantly navigating a society that barely tolerates him. He uses his practical, observational mind as a shield. He doesn't judge the decay of the city like Stephen does.
He just observes it.
Yeah, he tries to figure out how it works and tries to be kind where he can.
But that quiet, cautious navigation, that attempt to just keep his head down and process the world, can only last so long in a city this tense. Which means we are heading for a collision.
A big one.
Bloom's quiet, practical empathy is about to crash violently into the loud, aggressive paralysis of Dublin's political resentment.
And that explosion happens in Barney Kiernan's pub. This is one of the most intense, fiercely debated episodes in the book, often referred to by scholars as the Cyclops episode.
The analysis here requires us to look very closely at the language of a character known simply as the citizen.
And his terrifying dog, Gary Owen.
Yes, the dog. The citizen is an ultranationalist. He is a massive, loud, intimidating physical presence. And remember, listener, as we go into this scene, we are looking at this impartially as a historical character study. We are analyzing the mechanics of his rhetoric.
The citizen is holding court in the pub, and when Bloom walks in looking for a friend to help with an insurance matter for the Dignam family, the citizen immediately begins to target and mock him.
The citizen's language is a masterclass in aggressive, exclusionary rhetoric. He spouts fierce anti-English sentiment. He shouts, "Sin Thay Nam Hain," an Irish phrase meaning ourselves alone.
He goes on tirades about the subsidized organ of the British press poisoning the minds of the people, and he aggressively drinks to the friends we love and the foes we hate.
He divides the entire world into us and them. And obviously, in his eyes, Bloom is a them. This underlying tension comes to a boiling point when the citizen turns his aggression directly onto Bloom.
He looks at this man who has lived in Dublin for decades, whose wife is Irish, and he aggressively asks him, "What is your nation?"
It is a profound, incredibly threatening moment. The citizen is demanding that Bloom justify his existence in a space where the citizen holds the power. And Bloom's response is so stripped down, so simple, but so loaded. He just says, "Ireland. I was born here. Ireland."
He refuses to be pushed out. He stakes his claim on the dirt he was born on.
If we look at the macro structure of the book, this pub scene ties back perfectly to an earlier scene involving Stephen Dedalus. Earlier in the day, Stephen is getting paid by his boss, a schoolmaster named Mr. Deasy.
Now, Deasy is an older, wealthy, pro-British unionist. He is on the exact opposite end of the political spectrum from the citizen, but he shares the citizen's exact exclusionary worldview.
In the excerpts, Deasy claims to Stephen that Ireland has the honor of being the only country that never persecuted the Jews. And when Stephen asks why that is, Deasy answers because she never let them in.
That is chilling.
You have Deasy on the wealthy, pro-British end of the spectrum, and the citizen on the rebellious, fiercely Irish nationalist end, yet they both arrive at the exact same xenophobic punchline. They are two sides of the same exclusionary coin.
They both represent the historical trap that Joyce's characters are stuck in. It is a trap made of rigid history, inherited hatreds, and an obsession with purity.
It is the very thing Stephen Dedalus earlier in the text calls a nightmare from which he is trying to awake. History is a nightmare because it forces you to inherit battles you didn't start.
Wait, I need to look closer at the citizen's dialogue because I don't want to oversimplify what Joyce is doing here. The citizen is angry, yes. He is xenophobic, yes. But isn't he angry for a reason that is rooted in actual historical trauma?
What do you mean?
The sources highlight his dialogue where he talks about Ireland's ruined economy. He talks about the empty harbors in Galway and Kinsale, the ruined trade, the fleet of masts that used to be there but are now gone because of British economic policies.
Oh.
And earlier, in the Ivy Day excerpt from Dubliners, a character complains that the working man gets all kicks and no halfpence while the politicians talk. These are valid, documented historical and economic grievances resulting from colonial rule.
So how does Joyce balance the fact that the citizen's anger isn't just coming out of thin air?
That is a phenomenal observation, and it goes to the heart of Joyce's genius. Joyce doesn't deny the history of oppression, the economic devastation of colonialism, the empty harbors of Galway, the famine. These are objective facts in the world of the novel.
Right.
What Joyce handles so masterfully is showing how that valid historical grievance, that very real trauma, becomes utterly toxic when it is mixed with xenophobia. The citizen takes a legitimate historical wound and uses it as a weapon against a vulnerable individual who is standing right in front of him.
He uses his status as a historical victim to justify becoming an immediate victimizer of Leopold Bloom.
He weaponizes his own oppression.
So how does Bloom, who is completely outnumbered in this pub, counter that kind of overwhelming, historically fueled rage?
Yeah. Bloom counters it with a quiet, persistent insistence on a completely different, almost radical kind of patriotism. Amidst all this loud, performative shouting in the pub about blood and soil and ancient battles and dying for the cause, Bloom says, "You be patria, where you can live well if you work."
Where you can live well if you work. It's so incredibly grounded. It strips away all the romantic, violent mythology of war and nationhood and just makes it about basic human dignity.
It's about a safe place to lay your head and earn a living.
It is the heroism of the ordinary. But to capture all of this, to capture the chaotic collision of voices, the ancient hatreds, the quiet empathy, the commerce, the heavy history of the city, and the microscopic thoughts of the individuals, Joyce realized that a traditional narrative structure simply couldn't hold it.
A standard Victorian novel would have collapsed under the weight of this much simultaneous reality.
He had to invent a new literary technology. Which brings us to the actual mechanics of the book. We're looking at the form and function of the text itself. In the sources, we have an image of a page from Joyce's notebook titled Words.
It is a fascinating document.
It is just covered in dense, obsessive handwriting, categorizing language, crossing things out with different colored pencils. It doesn't look like the diary of a romantic poet. It looks like the notebook of an engineer or a mad scientist.
That notebook is proof that Joyce was treating language as a physical material, like clay or steel. He wasn't just telling a story, he was constructing an architecture.
In Ulysses, the style of the writing fundamentally changes from chapter to chapter to match the environment, the time of day, and even specific organs of the human body.
Wait, organs of the body? What do you mean he matched the style to organs?
Joyce designed Ulysses to encompass the entirety of the human experience, and that included the physical body. He mapped out an incredibly complex schema where each episode represents a different bodily organ. He wanted the book itself to be a living, breathing organism.
So the style of the prose mutates to reflect the function of that organ or that environment.
Okay, let's look at how that actually works in the excerpts, because the stylistic shifts are wild. For example, Bloom goes into a newspaper office in the episode known as Aeolus, and suddenly the text, which had been flowing along, is aggressively broken up by these capitalized newspaper headlines.
You are reading a paragraph, and suddenly there is a bold headline that says, sad, or ominous for him, or a collision ensues.
And in the bodily schema, the Aeolus episode represents the lungs. The newspaper office is full of wind, hot air, and the loud rhythmic thumping of the printing presses. The text itself becomes mechanical.
The headlines interrupt your reading the way the noise of a printing press interrupts a conversation. The form mimics the physical reality of the space.
And then, when Bloom is in the Ormond Hotel in the Sirens episode, the language shifts completely again. This episode represents the ear. The text stops caring about traditional grammar and starts relying entirely on sound, rhythm, and musical motifs.
We read phrases like bronze by gold, which refers to the hair color of the barmaids.
We see onomatopoeia like trick, chunk, mimicking the sound of a cash register. Snatches of song lyrics bleed directly into the narrative like, oh, Idoloris. The words themselves are attempting to sing.
He is pushing the English language to its absolute limits, trying to make words function as musical notes. But perhaps the most jarring and fascinating shift is in the late-night Ithaca episode, which represents the skeleton.
The entire section is written like a cold, hyper-objective scientific catechism.
Let's define catechism for the listener, just so we're all on the same page. A catechism is traditionally a religious text set up as a rigid series of questions and answers, used to teach doctrine. Who made the world? God made the world. That kind of thing.
Yes. But Joyce strips the religious content out of it and uses the rigid Q&A format to describe completely ordinary events with forensic scientific detachment. It removes all the internal emotional monologues we've been reading all day.
It is so bizarre to read.
Instead of saying, Stephen felt a connection to Bloom's past, the text asks the question, what was Stephen's auditive sensation?
And the critical answer is, he heard in a profound, ancient male, unfamiliar melody the accumulation of the past.
And then it asks, what was Bloom's visual sensation?
He saw in a quick, young male familiar form the predestination of a future.
It reads like an encyclopedia entry, attempting to quantify a deeply spiritual, emotional event. It is the skeleton of the book, holding up the massive weight of the day.
But to understand why Joyce does this, why he uses these extreme styles, we should look at the story Stephen Dedalus tells to some men in the newspaper office earlier in the day.
Oh, this is the perfect example. It's called The Parable of the Plums. Stephen is standing around with these journalists, and he decides to tell them a story about two old Dublin women, Anne Kearns and Florence McCabe.
They live ordinary, difficult lives.
They buy some brawn and bread, and they take a bag of plums to the very top of Nelson's Pillar, a massive, towering monument that used to stand at the center of Dublin. And what do these women do when they get up to this grand vantage point?
They just sit there on the steps. They're too tired to look out at the view. They just sit eating the plums, slowly spitting the plum stones out between the iron railings and wiping the juice off their mouths.
It is an incredibly mundane, almost anticlimactic anecdote. But Stephen grandly titles this story, A Pisgah Sight of Palestine,
which is a massive biblical reference. Pisgah is the mountain where Moses was allowed to look out and see the promised land, even though he wasn't allowed to enter it.
Stephen is giving a mythic biblical title to two tired old women spitting seeds off a statue.
And that is the entire key to Ulysses.
Wait, I have to play the proxy for the frustrated reader here,
Uh-huh.
because this all sounds incredibly exhausting.
It is demanding.
If the listener sitting in their car or going for a walk just wants to read a good story, why should they care about a chapter written like a science manual, or a music sheet, or a list of newspaper headlines? Why do we need to compare old women eating fruit to Moses?
Doesn't all this stylistic acrobatics and mythic referencing just get in the way of the actual plot? I completely understand that frustration. It is a demanding book. But the defense of Joyce's method is that the form is the story. The style is the substance.
By using the elevated language of myth, science, theology, and epic poetry to describe a man eating a cheese sandwich or a guy going to the bathroom or two old women eating plums, Joyce is making a radical, democratic, philosophical point.
He is validating the ordinary.
Yes, he is proving that every single human life is epic. He is saying that Leopold Bloom's walk across Dublin to buy a bar of soap and attend a funeral is as complex, as layered, and as historically significant as the ancient Greek hero Odysseus sailing across the Mediterranean to fight monsters and gods.
The stylistic acrobatics force the reader to look at a normal Tuesday as if it were a mythic journey. It demands that we treat the mundane with absolute reverence.
That reframes the entire experience. The difficulty of the text is the point. It forces you to slow down and pay attention to the microscopic details of a life you would normally ignore.
And all of these complex stylistic threads, all these wandering paths of these isolated characters are destined to intersect. Which brings us to the climax of our deep dive, the meeting of Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom.
All day long, these two men have been missing each other by mere inches. They pass each other in the street. They're in the same buildings at slightly different times.
And the psychological groundwork for why they so desperately need each other is laid out beautifully in a scene set in the National Library.
Steve is in the library holding court with some literary men, and he is delivering this brilliant, incredibly convoluted, highly academic theory about Shakespeare and the play Hamlet.
Stephen is obsessed with fathers and sons. He argues that in Hamlet, Shakespeare is not just playing the role of the ghost of the murdered father, which was the historical tradition.
He argues that Shakespeare poured his soul into the play in such a way that he is both the ghost of the father and the prince himself. He says the boy of Act 1 is the mature man of Act 5.
Stephen is exploring the theological concept of consubstantiality. Let's break that down simply for the listener. Consubstantiality is a heavy doctrine, usually referring to the Holy Trinity, the idea that God the Father and God the Son are of the same substance.
They are distinct, but made of the exact same stuff.
Stephen is taking that massive theological concept and applying it to biology and art. How are a father and son essentially the same, being at different points in time?
Stephen is trying to use intellect to solve an emotional void. He is lecturing about fathers and sons because he is completely estranged from his own biological father.
We saw Simon Dedalus earlier in the carriage and the pub.
Simon is a brilliant singing raconteur, a charming Dublin character, but he is essentially drinking away the family's money while his daughters go hungry and his son wanders the streets. Stephen is a son in desperate need of a stable father figure.
And as Stephen is giving this high-minded, abstract literary lecture about absent fathers, the text draws this profound, silent, structural parallel to Leopold Bloom.
We know from being inside Bloom's internal monologue all day that he is quietly, deeply grieving. He is mourning his infant son, Rudy, who died at just 11 days old, over 10 years ago.
The grief has fundamentally altered Bloom's life. The text notes, "No son of thy loins is by thee." Bloom's biological line is severed. His marriage has been physically paralyzed by this grief for a decade.
So you have a father searching for a son to pass his wisdom to, and a son searching for a father to ground him.
They are the missing pieces of each other's puzzle, and they finally connect in the late, dark hours of the night.
After a chaotic, surreal, hallucination-filled sequence in the red light district known as Nighttown, which the cold scientific catechism of the Ithaca episode simply describes as a chance medley in Beaver Street, Bloom steps in.
He rescues Stephen from a brawl with an aggressive English soldier. Bloom dusts the younger man off, takes him by the arm, and brings him back to his own home.
This is where that scientific catechism style becomes incredibly moving. By stripping away all the flowery sentimentality, the text delivers a massive emotional truth with forensic precision.
They are sitting in Bloom's kitchen, drinking hot cocoa, and the text says, "Bloom sees in Stephen the predestination of a future, and Stephen hears in Bloom the accumulation of the past."
It makes me think of an analogy. Their meeting feels like two rogue planets that have been wandering alone in the dark, freezing vacuum of space.
Oh.
And just for a moment, they pass close enough to catch each other's gravity.
Yes, and just like rogue planets, they don't lock into a permanent orbit. The physics of their emotional gravity pulls them together, they spin around each other for a few hours in the kitchen, they stabilize each other's trajectories, but they aren't going to stay together.
Stephen politely declines Bloom's offer to stay the night in the spare room. He is going to wander off again into the dark to forge his own path.
It's not a permanent fairy tale fix, but it is a moment of profound cosmic alignment. They stabilize each other just enough to keep going, and that brief alignment grants Bloom a moment of heartbreaking grace.
The final apparition we see in the sources is the emotional culmination of Bloom's entire Odyssey. After Stephen leaves, Bloom is left alone in his home, and wonderstruck, looking out into the space of the room, he silently calls out a name. Rudy.
And he sees a vision. But it isn't a horrific, traumatic memory of the dying 11-day-old infant in a coffin. He sees the boy as he would be now, at 11 years old, alive and thriving.
The text says Rudy is reading a book, kissing the page, smiling. He has a delicate mauve face, and on his suit he has diamond and ruby buttons, and he's holding a slim ivory cane.
It is an apparition of pure love, imagination, and reconciliation. The grief that has paralyzed Bloom's heart for a decade is finally faced, not with despair, but with a beautiful, tender, almost magical vision.
The wandering father has found a moment of internal peace.
It's just breathtaking. It takes hundreds of pages of mundane details, pub arguments, and city streets to earn that single moment of grace.
And that brings us to the end of our journey today. Let's take a step back and unpack our key takeaways. Through these incredibly dense sources, we've seen how James Joyce took the literal, suffocating paralysis of a single city in Dubliners and cracked it wide open to reveal a sprawling, microscopic universe in Ulysses.
We've explored the heavy weight of history, xenophobia, and nationalism, and contrasted it with the quiet, persistent, deeply human heroism of the ultimate outsider, Leopold Bloom. We've seen how empathy can be a tool for survival.
And we've seen the stunning, musical, scientific, and almost mad ways that language can be bent, broken, and rebuilt to capture the actual chaotic experience of the human mind. So why does this stack of notes, this dense, intimidating, century-old text, matter to you listening right now?
Because it is the ultimate proof that your own life, your frustrating morning commute, what you grab for lunch, your secret griefs, your random, weird passing thoughts about a billboard, none of it is mundane.
None of it is disposable. It is an epic waiting to be read.
Every single life is an Odyssey, if you look closely enough at the details.
Which brings me to a final thought for you to mull over. Early in the sources, Stephen Dedalus walks along the beach, closes his eyes, and thinks about what he calls the ineluctable modality of the visible.
It is a fancy way of describing the unavoidable reality of the physical world we are forced to see every day.
Tomorrow, when you walk down the street, try turning that observation inward. Try to really listen to your own internal monologue for just a few minutes. Notice the ads you read on the side of a bus.
Notice the smells from a bakery that suddenly trigger a memory from 10 years ago.
Notice the fragments of pop songs stuck in your head, colliding with your anxieties about a work email, mixed with what you want for dinner. Ask yourself, if someone were transcribing your thoughts for just 1 hour, completely uncensored, the way Joyce did for Bloom, what would it look like?
Would it read like a comedy, a tragedy, a chaotic jumble of noise, or a masterpiece of modern art?
The Odyssey isn't just an ancient myth about a guy on a boat. It's happening in your head right now.
It's all about how you choose to read the map of your own mind.
And suddenly, that map isn't just a set of lines and street names. It's a living, breathing universe. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.